Last Sunday, we heard the story of how the civil disobedience and acts of resistance of a few women saved the life of Moses during the regime of an insecure Pharaoh. Brian Bantam, in an article in the Christian Century this past July, wrote these words: "Perhaps revolution has always been enacted through the small acts that refuse to accommodate the regimes of death that press in upon us each day. Through their actions, Shipra and Puah, they planted a seed of God's freedom in the very heart of the empire's power." Brian Bantam from the Christian Century. It is in the heart of the Egyptian empire where Pharaoh's daughter, pulls Moses from the water and raises him in defiance of Pharaoh's devious decrees. It is there, in these halls of power, where Moses is formed by power and privilege with access to the best education. While living with this privilege, Moses also experiences some cognitive dissonance, and we understand that he is aware of his true heritage, that he knows that Aaron is his brother, is an enslaved Israelite. And Moses begins to develop relationships with his enslaved kin, and he begins to reject his identity, his Egyptian heritage, and starts identifying with the Israelites. And he sees the plight of his brothers and sisters. His rage is so intense after witnessing an Egyptian overseer, oppressor, beating an Israelite that Moses murders him. The next day, as he attempts to settle a fight between two Hebrews, his people reject him. To them, Moses was no different than the oppressive Egyptians. So his attempt to identify with his people, the Hebrews, failed, and now he is a political refugee and traitor wanted for murder. So he escapes from Egypt to Midian, where he adopts a third cultural identity, finding refuge with a Midianite clan in the wilderness, and he marries Jethro's daughter. Separated from his Hebrew and Egyptian roots, and he's out of his privileged life, Moses is out of his depth. He felt so lost as an exile in the beginning that he names his son Gershom, which means literally stranger there, as an expression of his loneliness. All he wants, we can imagine, is a safe, comfortable life and to forget about his past. He keeps his head down and he takes care of his father-in-law's herd. He becomes a shepherd, which is anathema to Egyptians. And he's finally living a comfortable enough life. 40 years go by before God meets up with Moses, who is minding his own business, as many of us are when God approaches us. He's tending the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro. One day, out with his flocks, Moses notices a strangely burning bush that is not consumed. And instead of just passing by, curiosity gets the best of him. Scripture explicitly says that Moses turned aside. His curiosity leads to theophany, a personal encounter with the eternal, with the divine. It also leads to an epiphany, a recognition of God's presence with him. British author and rabbi Eli Sarah writes, "The real miracle was that Moses noticed. The messenger of the eternal could only appear to Moses because he turned aside. He allowed himself to be apprehended by the Holy One. The burning bush that Moses encountered came with a message to liberate the slaves. The signpost to the great mission Moses was called on to perform was so subtle that he could have easily missed it. He could have so easily not seen it and just walked on by. And if Moses had walked on by, he would have continued to live out his days as a shepherd in Midian. Without turning aside, there would be no Exodus. If Moses had not turned aside, the story would end." These words from Rabbi Eli Sarah. Here we are, just living our lives, set on our own direction, our path, our own busyness, our own distraction, that we might miss out on what God is doing here and now in our very lives. The burning bushes that God sends our way, it might not look like the bush that Moses observed, but we all have our different burning bushes that God sends our way. How do we not miss out? There are times where we need to pause, to turn aside, so we capture the opportunity to encounter the divine, of being in God's presence. By not paying attention, we might miss things. We might miss people. Turning aside is perhaps the beginning of prayer. Moses turned aside. He got off the path. And what we notice in how the story is laid out frame by frame, that God did not speak until Moses turned aside. It was when God saw that Moses had turned aside that God calls out, "Moses, Moses," and Moses responds, "Here I am." He might have said, "Here I am, Lord. It is I, Lord." One might wonder if the action of turning aside actually brought forth God's speech. Does God wait for us to notice, to turn aside as well? Perhaps it is within the nature of God, who longs to be with, to be relational. And then we discover that where Moses is standing is holy ground, and the voice tells him to take off his shoes. I didn't realize, or I had forgotten, that St. Francis wore no shoes. Instead, journeying barefoot, vulnerable to the ground, finding his balance, bringing deeper awareness to God's presence, recognizing that all of the earth that he stood on, all of creation, is holy ground. We too are standing on holy ground, and there is something about a spiritual practice of taking off our shoes and wandering barefoot to feel the foundation of creation, the ground beneath us. God speaks again, and this voice, or the voice of God, the angel, the messenger, seems to know a lot about the enslaved people that Moses has left behind. In scripture, we read their cries for help rose up to God. And God is calling Moses to return to his people, that God will lead them to live in a land of abundance. Promises that sound great but cannot happen on their own. Promises that require something of Moses. Except that Moses is finally comfortable with his life, or as comfortable as he's going to get. He's enjoying his children, his wife, his extended family. After 40 years, he's accepted as much as he can his third identity, living with the Midianite community who had adopted him. He's not looking or dreaming for more than this. He protests. He's well aware of his limitations. He knows his history. He's a wanted man for murder. He has an identity problem. Was he a Hebrew? Was he Egyptian? Or now is he a Midianite? He's also anxious about his abilities. He keeps arguing with this voice, with this messenger. He's already been rejected by his people, and he's wanted by the people that he grew up with. How will the Hebrew people accept his leadership and authority? It's like what we hear later in scripture: no one can return to their hometown and be accepted. And Moses says, if the people ask me who sent me, what am I going to tell them? Who are you? What is your name? And the voice says, tell them, I am sent me to you. It's a mysterious name. This phrase, these two words, became a combination of 4 consonants called the tetragrammaton in Hebrew, translated as Yahweh or Yahweh in some Bibles, Jehovah in others, but this name is actually never spoken aloud by Jewish people. It is too holy to be spoken aloud by our Jewish friends. There's a curious link between this phrase, I am, Yahweh, Yahweh, and breath, ruach, pneuma, and spirit. Rabbi Lawrence Kushner, a mystic scholar, explains in an article, Breathing the Name of God. The letters of the name of God in Hebrew are Yod, He, Vav, He. Yod, He, Vav, He. They are frequently mispronounced as Yahweh or Yahweh, but in truth, they are unutterable. Not because of the holiness they evoke necessarily, but because they are all vowels. And you cannot pronounce all the vowels at once without risking a respiratory injury. This word is the sound of breathing. That these letters are unpronounceable is no accident. Just as it is no accident that they are also the root letters of the 4-letter name of God. Just as it is no accident that they are also the root letters of the Hebrew verb to be. And so sometimes we hear God's name as I am what I am, I will be what I will be, I will create what I will create. Scholars have suggested that a translation of the 4-letter name of God might be the one who brings into being all that is. So God's name is the name of existence itself. Since God is holy, then so is all creation. Here is a name, a God who is neither completed nor finished. This God is literally not yet. These words from Rabbi Lawrence Kushner, breathing in the name of God. Rabbis say that this combination of letters is more akin to breathing than speech. Yod, He, Vav, He. One wonders then, could breathing, the very act of breath, breathing in, breathing out, could breathing be one of the names for God? Could the very act of breathing be a prayer? What if we looked at our prayer life and people say, oh, I haven't done very well with my prayer life lately. I haven't been spending God. What if we flipped that around, flipped the script, and considered the very act of breathing and bringing attention to our breath, and that God gives us breath, and thanking God for this breath, and realized that this is prayer. God continues, or the voice, the messenger of God continues. Thus you shall say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my name for all generations. What if God is not only behind or beyond all words, that God's name is attached to human names? I am the God of Abraham, and God offers this litany of names. The God of Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel, the God of Mary Magdalene, the God of Sojourner Truth. We could list all of the names throughout history. Where will you add your name in relationship to God? Perhaps it is similar to calling ourselves children of God. The visuals that Tom placed on the hymn, The God of Abram Praise, show a God that cannot be contained in the galaxies. Mystery, majesty, transcendent, immortal, invisible, relational. The Holy God waits for us to notice, to turn aside, to literally breathe, and in so doing, notice it as prayer to the one who created us, who loves us, who continues to call us forth. The dialogue continues in a back and forth, and mostly it's Moses protesting. Moses offering excuse after excuse after excuse. What if they won't believe me if I tell them who sent me? You have forgotten that I'm a very poor public speaker. I'm slow of speech. Send someone else, like, oh, I've got it. My brother Aaron, send him. Moses is throwing Aaron under the bus, so to speak. Moses had convinced himself that he absolutely does not have the skill, the courage, the persuasiveness, the gifts, the experience, the standing, the stature, the anything to pull this off. He could begin a litany of, I am not enough of this or this or this, and I'm too much of that. There's a dialogue that was so brilliantly executed by the small family. I don't think I'll get the voice of God out of my head in this reading. And we heard Ben portraying this voice ask, Moses, what is in your hand? And the question helps Moses recognize that he already possesses all the resources needed to fulfill God's calling, because God has gifted him and God has called him. Raised in Pharaoh's court with privilege, education, and insider's understanding of power, Moses also possessed survival skills he acquired in the wilderness that would prove invaluable when leading a resistant people through tough terrain and punishing desert, even though they got lost multiple times, apparently. Moses also had a love for his people, And God was calling this Egyptian, Hebrew, Midianite Moses, who holds a unique tri-cultural gift. And he happens to be holding a staff that God would symbolically use to liberate a nation. What is in your hand, Moses? Finally, Moses stops talking and starts moving. He pushes through the wall of self-doubt, inadequacy, whatever fear is in his way. And we're going to be hearing the rest of the story in the coming weeks. And we might ask, well, God called Moses. He must be living the dream life. Things got so much easier and better for Moses after that. And if we know the rest of the story, we could say, not so much. Because this was the day when his real troubles would begin. And he had the presence of God, the power of God, the relationship with God at his side and at his back. Even though he never steps foot in the promised land. There are still cries of suffering in the world. God still needs companions to hear God's name and do God's bidding. We too will protest. We will come up with all kinds of excuses why we cannot, would not, will not be effective. We lack the knowledge, the ability, the energy, the resources, the clout, the whatever. We will come up against the wall of our own limitations and self-doubt and inadequacy or complacency or apathy in not wanting to get involved. What is in your hand, Moses? God asks us this question as well. What is in your hand? It might seem insignificant, like Moses must have looked at the staff he was holding and say, this God, this staff, okay. But we will see how God will use that staff. David had a sling and stones to defeat Goliath. The boy in the Gospels had 5 loaves and 2 fish. The woman had an alabaster jar filled with oil to anoint Jesus. We all have something in our hands, in our possession. As we release our hands, what is in it? God is ready to anoint it. What is in your hand? How are you making it available for God's purpose? Will you turn aside? God is able to use whatever we offer for the sake of the common good. When we use whatever is in our hand with courage and compassion, we begin to contribute toward building of God's realm on earth. In the power of the burning bush, in the quiet stillness, in the everyday noise of living, God is calling each one of us, inviting us to trust the gifts that God has bestowed upon us. You are beloved. You are blessed. You are gifted by God to be a blessing to others. May it be so.